nice long fill day, and I'm going to talk to you about MySQL high availability in 2023 and the best practices around it. I've been involved in the MySQL world for more than 20 years. I've come from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, so not quite jet lagged, but definitely on some kind of interesting time zone. Also, I guess it's worth noting that today, after the Great Depression, the 18th bank in the US by assets has officially shut down. Silicon Valley Bank, in case you were following the news, actually shut down just moments ago. So now you can get off Twitter and focus on MySQL HA. So what is HA? We, in the MySQL world, love to focus on transactions per second, not transactions per minute. We also like to focus on latency, which is the response time, typically measured in percentiles. We really focus on durability, the D in ACID, so you never lose commit data. So you always have replicas, snapshots, point-in-time recovery, backups. We really like to focus on replication, all kinds of replication to ensure you have redundancy. And also, of course, clustering. Clustering involves monitoring, involves recovery, failover, as well as you want to ensure no time that the service is ever down. So no single point of failure. I have a quick question before we start. How many of you are running MySQL 8? How many are on 5.7? 5.6? 5.5? MariaDB 10.6 or greater? Nobody runs MariaDB? Okay. Percona Server 8? 5.7? Okay, the rest of you don't run MySQL? Okay, that's fair. Maybe you will consider running MySQL, though after more than 25 years in existence, if you aren't running MySQL now, you probably won't start today. So the beauty of MySQL being around for so long is that there are so many solutions. You've got the likes of Galore Cluster, which includes MariaDB Galore Cluster, Percona XDB Cluster, which has been around for about 15 years. You've got group replication with MySQL InnoDB Cluster, which has been around easily for over 5 years. It sort of made its way in a later release of 5.7. It made it's very robust in 8.0. In fact, it gets more robust every time MySQL makes a minor release. So I don't know how many of you enjoy using software or upgrading your software. How many of you like to upgrade software? Okay, some of you do. So if you're upgrading MySQL, it's super interesting because you almost always get a new feature in group replication. It's not just bug fixes usually, it's also nice new features to make InnoDB cluster more useful for you. And this happens approximately once every 3 months. So you have to pay close attention to these release notes. In fact, sometimes there are other changes that get released that also break compatibility in some way, shape, or form. So highly recommend you spend time on the bugs database, the Percona blog, etc., to find new information about changes that may affect your production use cases. We have failover frameworks. MHA is surprisingly still robust, still utilized. We have Orchestrator at risk of being abandonware, but getting features being pushed, also still utilized. We've got NDB cluster. Anybody use NDB cluster? I was expecting that. Like, no one should put their hand up, I'm guessing. It's very, very niche. But it's also been around for a long time. It's still very much around. There's DRBD. Also inside of Linux, you don't have to get any weird patches. Anybody use DRBD? No? Okay. Cloud has lots of HA out of the box and plenty of proxies out there. You've got router, max scale, ProxySQL, and I've only listed the ones that actually are like basically level 7 proxies. The level 4 proxies like HA proxy are still very popular. There's Galore load balancer. Sometimes people use Nginx. So there are so many solutions because, well, MySQL isn't new, and sometimes you'll find solutions that exist that have also disappeared over time. So they get deprecated, etc. We really do like to get many, many nines of levels of availability, right? So very fashionable to say you never want downtime, or you want 6 nines worth of uptime, or even 5 nines worth of uptime. And actually, you can achieve 5 nines worth of uptime with your MySQL setup. Of course, this doesn't mean you set up a 2-node Galera cluster if that was your idea of high availability, or if you're setting up a primary with a secondary, you should also utilize, some kind of failover framework and so forth. So you should probably aim for 5-9 uptime in most situations. And when you deal with downtime at scale, you really do measure this in thousands of hours. Your failures never trigger ops to ever come back because you have replicated copies of the data being served just fine. HA is totally about redundancy. So you're familiar with RAID probably, you're familiar with clustering servers. Most servers you buy have 2 PSUs. You always have more than one network card. And more interestingly, you've also got geographical replication, right? You can have data centers that are not only in one location. So you send your computation to other data centers. So it turns out that there are many reasons for failure. So even the immutable O'Reilly has failed before. You could have environmental failures, deliberate failures, utilities like loss of power is quite common, equipment breakdown. Fires and floods are more common than you think. Data centers do burn down. In fact, even last year we see data centers burn down that make you have loss of service. So if you're just running everything in one data center, I'd suggest thinking about having more than one. How many of you run in more than one data center today for production use cases? Okay. So for the rest of you, you should really consider this largely because, centers go down. And if you use the cloud, like Amazon, for example, and so forth, they all have the idea of an availability zone in one region. So they're separate, and the chance of all availability zones going down should be hopefully minimal. But even Amazon goes down, so not a panacea. And all the clouds, not just Amazon, to be clear. Your business considerations probably include having good high uptime, cost of business impact, as well as your risk management. Offsite data storage makes a lot of sense, and you're really building resilience into your infrastructure, right? You want to be close to your users, you want to have performance, reliability, scalability, as well as resilience. And there's a lot of things to think about. So even if you're running a proxy, you should think, oh, I'm going to have more than one proxy, because then that's your single point of failure. We all like durability. And lately, I've actually noticed more and more people are not actually running XFS or ext4 as their file systems. They're running ZFS as a file system. Is anybody running ZFS as a base file system? Okay, very interesting. So XFS, ext4, we have things like no A time, but also we have also got group comment, the binary log in MySQL to improve performance. Definitely HA is harder for databases because you've got to measure hardware resources as well as data needing to be redundant. And this data is probably not static data, it's constantly changing data. So you want to have the operations continuing uninterrupted, not by restoring a new backup server. In fact, lots of maybe older posts on the internet will tell you things like, you should have a large InnoDB log file size. And when your server crashes and recovers and you have a large InnoDB log file size, it can take quite some time before InnoDB itself recovers. The question is, do you really need a large InnoDB log file size if you're having copies of the data somewhere else? Maybe you don't, because it doesn't matter if a node goes away. How many of you use the likes of Kubernetes, for example? So you're probably all familiar with the fact that these pods come and go, right? So your data should also probably not be reliant on having long recovery times because things come and go. With clients, we always see people saying things like, oh, why don't we just use a SAN? Or more interestingly, we hear, why don't we launch a 3-node cluster using VMware with SAN as a backing? Well, for one, unless you're running Affinity, if you run a 3-node cluster on a VMware instance, then it happens to be on one host, that host goes down, there goes your cluster. And I guess the other thing is, if you run a SAN, and your SAN goes down, well, there goes your cluster. So the MySQL methodology has always been scale out versus scale up. So you should really run local storage. And you don't need a SAN operator to run said SAN. And you can still have active solutions without having shared storage. So probably this is not the solution if you're going MySQL. So I asked earlier if anybody here used DRBD still, and the answer was almost a resounding no, because for the people that like SANs, they also think DRBD could be useful for them because they think, oh, I can't lose a transaction, and I can tolerate this longer failover, and I can tolerate worse performance. Maybe the biggest user of DRBD in production was Amazon RDS, running in multi-AZ mode, right? So they'd give you a replica that you couldn't use. But even Amazon moved away from DRBD. Sometime last year, they actually made a fairly good announcement stating that they've actually switched to semi-sync replication, and now failover time is in like a 30 or 35-second scenario. So how many here use Amazon RDS? Have you noticed that you got benefits from this? If you're using multi-AZ, did you notice you got benefits from it? Besides only paying Amazon like the extra 50%, the cost savings, the performance improvement. Your RDS should be performing much better if you're using the newer releases of RDS. Did you all know that Amazon switched to semi-sync sometime last year? Then we have redundancy through MySQL replication, right? So I've actually specifically split up MySQL and MariaDB server replication really because they are two different types of replication. They are not the same any longer. You can't just attach a secondary from one to the other and expect to just have it work easily. Things don't work that way any longer. Galeore Cluster also, or PXC, or MariaDB Galore Cluster, NDB Cluster, which we won't talk too much about. Of course, your storage requirements are multiplied, but you have huge potential for scaling out. So there are three different types of replication you can get in your standard MySQL server. You get the asynchronous replication, which is the default, where you insert into a primary, and it may or may not reach a secondary. This has improved tremendously. With multi-threaded slaves, it should most likely reach a secondary pretty quickly. You've also got semi-synchronous replication, where you insert into a primary, and it will guarantee that it reaches at least one secondary. And then you've got virtually synchronous Galore Cluster and group replication, where you more or less insert into 3 nodes or 5 nodes and so forth. So there are multiple ways of replication. In MySQL, semi-sync is a plugin, so you have to load it if you want to run it. In MariaDB, semi-sync is built in. In MySQL, you have to load Galore Cluster as a separate install, whereas in MariaDB, it's just there, you turn it on. MySQL replication always used to be statement-based, but honestly, it's been row-based since easily 5.5. So it's the default in 5.7, 8.0, but MariaDB has chosen to be different. MariaDB chooses mixed mode replication as a default, which means that if you configure a MariaDB server, you really do need to turn on row-based replication yourself. Mixed mode generally results in statement except if calling something like a storage engine that doesn't allow statement-based replication like NDB cluster. And I don't know how many of you use multiple storage engines. Who uses anything besides InnoDB? Okay, what do you use besides InnoDB? Okay, you're still using MySQL, you need to upgrade. Black hole, okay, wow, I haven't heard that one in a long time. All of it, okay. So is anybody using MyRox or RoxDB? Okay, you get MyRox in Percona server, you get it inside of MariaDB. In fact, if you use Amazon RDS for MariaDB, you actually also get MyRox. It's been shipped for quite some time now, as a heads up. So actually, I don't know how many of you follow bugs.mysql.com, but Facebook regularly makes storage engine changes all the time because they don't necessarily only use InnoDB. They actually use a lot of MyRox. So if you watch the bug system, you'll actually notice that they make lots of interesting changes to improve storage engine capabilities of many features. And this is around replication layer, and it's also around like doing consistent backups across replication engines. So as I mentioned earlier, MySQL replication is async by default. But you should consider also potentially using semi-sync. Does anybody use semi-sync replication? Okay, that's good. And you could also consider using fully or virtually synchronous replication, either from Galera or group replication. I don't know how many of you are aware of FlexiRaft. So earlier I said there are only 3 types of replication, but there's actually a 4th type of replication in MySQL today, and that's FlexiRaft. It's actually a Raft-based consensus released inside of the Facebook tree. So if you today go and read, there's a paper, it's public, and the code has been in the 8.0 tree, also public on GitHub. The only caveat for you to try FlexiRaft is you have to compile the software yourself. So it's not that hard to compile MySQL 8, but it's maybe harder to compile MySQL 8 with all these extra features. So if you ever wanted Raft-based replication inside of MySQL, the Facebook tree is actually there for you for the taking. And at some stage, maybe we will see the likes of MariaDB or Percona adapt FlexiRaft, offering yet another replication method to people. So semi-sync used to be really how Facebook ran at scale. It's probably still how the likes of Google run at scale. So basically you get a thread that performs a transaction commit on the master that blocks after the commit is done, waits until at least one secondary acknowledges that it has received all events, or until a timeout occurs. And it's actually lossless semi-sync now, so there's no risk of phantom reads, because it only acknowledges a transaction event after it is written to relay log and flush the disk. One thing good about having MySQL and MariaDB sort of compete with each other is that they both actually drive development and make replication better. So it's not about which one comes out with a feature first, because if one comes out with a feature like time-delayed replication it came to MySQL 5.6 first, it came to MariaDB several years later, it actually pushes everyone forward. It's just like around the time of 5.6, you'd expect that MariaDB introduced multi-source or multi-channel replication. MySQL came out with it much later, but improved it by having even more channels. Whereas MariaDB had less channels. Channels are basically sources of masters. And eventually, even MariaDB changed. Group commit in the binary log came to MySQL 5.6 and has been very consistent inside of even MariaDB. It's generally very useful, and the good news is that, like in MariaDB, for example, it definitely works even with MyRox. So start transaction with engine, you can actually use start transaction with consistent snapshot for MyRox and InnoDB, not just InnoDB. So in the MySQL world, there was something called Continuum and Replicator quite some time ago. In fact, Continuum is still very much around. They just pivoted easily like 3 or 4 times. And more or less, multi-source was something that Tungsten actually sort of had first. How did Tungsten do this? They'd read the binary logs of MySQL and have something called a transaction history log, so they'd sort of double the size of your on-disk usage. But the transaction history log would allow you to do things like multi-source replication. In fact, Tungsten was maybe very ahead of its time in terms of what it could do with replication topologies. But then they, I guess, sort of lost their way and got acquired and then spun out again. And eventually the main product, or products, managed to get said features. So there are actually syntax differences in both the 5780 versus MariaDB. And it's probably worth noting, beyond that, MySQL and MariaDB are deprecating the use of calling things master and slave. So going forward, you've got things like change replication source. You refer to things as primary and secondary. It's not removed yet, but it's been deprecated for at least all of last year. So I don't know when it'll be removed, probably in the future release of MySQL, and at some stage even MariaDB. How many of you use global transaction IDs? Okay. So, one of the reasons why there's such a divergence in MariaDB and MySQL was, besides the optimizer, was actually a replication scenario. Basically, global transaction IDs in MySQL 5.6 required you to shut down servers all at once to actually enable GTID. And MariaDB said this is not how it should work. We should find a divergence. I believe actually Facebook found a good workaround, and then Percona actually implemented it in Percona Server, and then 5.7 implemented it in a similar fashion where you didn't have to restart all servers. But this was one of the reasons why MariaDB diverged quite completely in terms of high availability solutions from MySQL. There's also parallel replication, and depending on what kind of server you end up using, some of it could be run per table, some of it could be run per database. So generally, you can make your secondary as fast as your primary. And you also find that with parallel replication, you can detect non-conflicting row-based events by comparing primary keys and then executing these in parallel. So, and in MariaDB, for example, optimistic parallel replication is turned on by default, so you sort of just have it. 5.7 came along, and honestly speaking, there are plenty of useful features, like you could tune your binary group commit sync delays, for example. Semi-synchronous improved tremendously. You have access support even when the binary log is turned on. Intra-schema parallel replication replaced the idea of you having to warm up secondary. And it's really interesting that I still put this slide up here, because in 6 months or less, come October, 5.7 will be end of life. So if you're running 5.7, I suggest you upgrade, or plan to upgrade soon to 8.0. We actually hear a lot of feedback from customers and clients that they're scared of 8.0 because it became stricter, there's lots of changes even in point releases. But you're reaching a highway where you're very rapidly running out of road. So even on Monday, I have a call with a client who is going to try to migrate a massive 5.5 Galore Cluster, 5.5, to 8.0, via possibly going to 5.7 first and then 8.0. So we don't necessarily recommend you skipping versions and upgrades. It's always meant to go from 5.5, 6, 7, 8. Though MariaDB does very much more or less claim that if you even jump from 10.6 to 10.11, it should generally work. So I'd say plan for a migration ASAP. Now, 8.0, awesome piece of software. Highly recommend you look at it a lot more. Besides fully encrypting the binary log, besides having, server version kept inside a transaction in the binary log, I think maybe the biggest thing I like from 8.0 is the clone plugin. Does anybody use the clone plugin? Okay, for the rest of you on 8.0, I highly recommend you check out the clone plugin. Basically, it came, I'd say, at least 10 releases ago in MySQL. Permits cloning data locally or from remote MySQL server instances. So this data is actually a physical snapshot of data stored in InnoDB that includes schemas, tables, table spaces. And this data basically is a fully functioning data directory, and you can just use it for server provisioning. In fact, one of the coolest things about the clone plugin is it's fast. It's faster than using, say, extra backup. In fact, in Galera 8.0, the upstream Galera from Codeship, we enable the clone plugin for SSTs, and SSTs are faster than using extra backup. So this is actually pretty useful. So if you haven't already used the clone plugin, I highly recommend you take a gander. So here are examples of things like binary logs expiring log seconds. You'll find that when I said it helps that everyone's actually developing servers, even though there may be a 5-year gap in features appearing in a production release, they do appear, including things like a compressed binary log. So I think this is one of the key crucial features that you should always remember, is that in open source, the more competition, actually probably the better, because everyone works to making better things for you. If, however, you find that replication goes out of sync, and we make so many changes, right? Like if you're finding corruption, we know we can do checksums, for example, nowadays. If you're doing things like replication filtering, you should obviously make sure you're replication filtering and not doing it in a cluster of some sort. And of course, there are replication bugs that do exist. There are plenty of tools out there to help you, right? Percona Toolkit is a very useful toolkit. We've got PT slave find, table checksum, PT table sync. Does anybody here know that MariaDB tools exist? Okay, yeah. So MariaDB tools is not a direct fork of Percona Toolkit, but it has Percona Toolkit. It has some Palomino cluster tools. I don't know if anyone remembers Palomino DB. They were a company that exists. Some people here even worked there. So they had a cluster tool, and what MariaDB tools has done is they've taken a lot of these tools that they found useful. Some of it they just renamed, obviously, like some of the Percona Toolkit stuff, but some of it they actually took tools that don't get maintained any longer. So they actually have extra stuff for you. So talk to you a little bit about Galeore Cluster. It's a transactional storage engine, InnoDB only. It's virtually synchronous, given that while it is logically synchronous, the actual writing and committing to the table space happens independently, and thus asynchronously on each node. It does use a quorum algorithm, so we do require you to have a minimum of 3 nodes. It also makes use of optimistic concurrency control, which means the transactions are done locally until commit time, then applied across all nodes. And plenty of users, right? Because it's been around for 15 years. You'd find it everywhere, from likes of Mercado Libre, PagerDuty, AVG, etc. If you're using 5.7, I recommend upgrading to 8.0 because you get Galera Cluster 4. MariaDB 10.4 was the first to have it, though at this stage you probably should only be using MariaDB 10.6 and greater. If you're using MariaDB, naturally remember they have now long-term support releases and short-term support releases. So you really only want to load up a long-term support release for 5 years support rather than a short-term release which gets bad in 1 year. And with Galera 4, you have the ability to have streaming replication, so you can have larger transactions, bigger than 1 gigabyte or even 2 gigabytes, because you can actually control it with streaming replication. So if you're doing large load data in files, this can be very handy for you. It can be controlled at session time as well, such that the replicated fragments applied in secondary threads, preserving transaction state in all cluster nodes. And these fragments basically hold locks on all nodes, and then it can't be conflicted later. So basically, you get write sets that are larger than 2 gigabytes in size without any issue. And actually, I think the biggest complaint with Galera Cluster is people go, why can't I do a load data in file and have it just work? And this is maybe the best solution for it, is that you can have it just work. It has overhead, of course, and the overhead will reduce, but it's there. This is, of course, the ideal scenario where your application can read and write to any node. But the reality is you probably do want to have some kind of proxy in between, because you might not benefit from reading and writing to every node, especially if you have things like hot rows, where the transactions are starting to conflict a lot. So you can actually enable logging and see priority transactions, victim transactions. And sometimes the server actually recovers this itself. But if you're doing a lot of updates to the same row, for example, or if you're doing something kind of odd, like running a counter in the database, really you shouldn't, or a queue, then you won't benefit from the fact that Galera is writing to 3 nodes, because you're going to get a lot of rollbacks and retries. But Galera does work over a wide area network as well, so you don't have to run 3 data centers with asynchronous replication between them. You can run synchronous replication between them as well. PXE is actually really interesting because you get a lot of engineering within Percona. It comes with ProxySQL and a ProxySQL admin tool. It comes with Percona monitoring and management integration. You get all the benefits of the MySQL 8 feature set. In addition, what Percona does is they occasionally also open source enterprise features that are available inside of Galera. So Galeore Enterprise has a bunch of features, like online schema changes with non-blocking operations. This is also actually, I think, a huge complaint with Galera itself. If you're doing a schema change, you've got this total auto isolation and a rolling schema upgrade. But if you could have this non-blocking operation, which is very lightweight total auto isolation, you actually gain a lot. And a good example is, Percona's ported it, likely from the MariaDB Enterprise variant. Because if you are a customer, you can get the enterprise software, ask the source, look at it, it's all on a GPL, and be inspired. Percona also provides a Kubernetes operator, very useful, I'd say. So another option for you in terms of a server for Galera Cluster. I don't have a dedicated MariaDB Galera Cluster slide because it has everything plus MariaDB. But I also should probably talk to you a little bit about group replication and InnoDB cluster. I believe we have a talk on group replication later today. So I highly recommend you go to that one as well. It's a variant of the Paxos protocol, supporting multiple leaders, can use SSL. It's got Elastic. It's got, nowadays, it even has more automatic provisioning inside. And it's generally useful. So, if I were you, I'd spend your time looking at release notes, because every 2 to 3 months, InnoDB cluster improves itself. So what may have been a limitation, say, in an older release, may have literally fixed itself in a quarter, and including things like TLS support and so forth. It still does, however, have a limitation of having 9 servers in one group, compared to Galera if you want to run more. And I am seeing lots of movement, like we've seen Booking.com start moving to it. We've seen movements from Percona in this respect, so I'd say continue paying attention to Galera, to InnoDB cluster and group replication. NDB cluster is maybe the first NoSQL database out there, because it actually, when acquired, had no SQL interface. It literally had an SQL interface tacked onto it. It's very high performance, typically used in telcos, but you need like 5 nodes to get it running. It's probably not as cheap as you expect, and so forth. So how do we handle failure? You can poll, you can monitor, you can have alerts. So an interesting piece of kit, for example, is like Percona monitoring and management. How would that alert you? You have to possibly do some integration there. And you can also look at it if the error is returned to or handled on the client side. Also, like we get questions like, what happens if I have an application, but I have like nodes across multiple data centers, but the application only in one data center. Well, that's probably not sensible architecture because your database survived, but your application may have died. So probably you should think about ensuring that you also don't have split brain. So ensure that your disconnected replicas cannot both commit independently. So this one, there's disadvantages of having a two-node Galera cluster, like a two data center Galera cluster or two nodes, right? If you have two data centers, 3 nodes each, if there is a split in network traffic, the consensus algorithm says both 3 nodes are actually legit and alive. They both get commits. And then when it's time when the network connection comes back again, there's no way to sync this data, right, easily. So one's going to win over the other. So if you're probably using the likes of Galera, make sure you have binary log replication turned on as well. Does anybody use Orchestrator? Not the planet scale variant, the open source variant. Okay, so Orchestrator is an awesome piece of kit. It reads replication topologies, keeps state. It does continuous polling. It can also modify your topologies. You can move your secondaries around. It's got a superb GUI. It's Apache 2 licensed. I'd say it's very well documented. It's moved from Outbrain to Booking. So it took a lot of effort to find this old screenshot from Outbrain, because that was the first release of Orchestrator, written in Go. But there's potentially a minor abandonware risk because the maintainer himself decided he wanted to reduce his open source involvement. He's probably doing something similar in his day job, and there have been patches coming in from Percona. Some of them have been applied. So this one's sort of something you should, if you're thinking about using, remember it's open source. It's Go. It's probably looking for a new maintainer or maintainers. There was a chat that was started up after FOSDEM, so about a month ago, that sort of fizzled out shortly after FOSDEM about getting a new maintainer to maintain it. So if you're looking for an open source project to contribute to, this could be something interesting as well. I actually think there's plenty of use out of this. MHA probably hasn't gotten an update in easily 4 or 5 years, but it's still very much used. Their production use cases, it's a piece of Perl software, handles automated and manual failovers. Topologies, can have one master, multiple secondaries, and you can also have intermediate secondaries as well, or intermediate masters as they're referred to. And you can use it in conjunction with other solutions. This was also developed at DNA, but the author now works at Facebook, and they have much more interesting things to do internally. So yeah. Proxies. How many of you use a proxy of some sort? Okay, clearly not as many. So MySQL obviously recommends Router, because Router is really integrated with MySQL 8, and MySQL Shell is truly quite special software. Like, you can actually control pretty much everything from within the MySQL Shell. Has anybody here used MySQL Shell, use it daily, like it? Okay. Aware MySQL Shell exists in 8.0. Okay, so yeah, Shell is actually useful. MariaDB server recommends this thing called MaxScale. Has anybody used MaxScale before? Okay, handful. Percona used to be fairly staunchly recommending ProxySQL, but now with also the Kubernetes operator have integrated HA proxy. So maybe they're hedging bets as to which proxy to go for. But remember, ProxySQL is a level 7 proxy. HA proxy is a level 4 proxy. ProxySQL, of course, works with all servers. So MaxScale, interesting piece of software, was open source for a very long time. Now is source available. It changed from the GPL v2 to something known as a business source license almost overnight, which is what is known as time-delayed open source. So it's been tried before. GoScript, Aladdin made it GPL after a year. And it turns out that when MariaDB came up with this MaxScale license, called the business source license, now it's not unique any longer. There are many other databases using the business source license. So I know that we're at scale, and I presume you all like open source as opposed to business source. So I think there's got to be a clear definition that open source is different from source available, where you can see the source, but it's not actually open source. And I don't know if many of you may have realized, but MariaDB, as a company, went public last year in December. So it's now trading on the stock market as MariaDB PLC. And they used to allow MaxScale to become GPL after 2 years. Now it becomes GPL after 4 years. So effectively, the software, if you plan to use MaxScale, and also we're not very clear what it means if it works with a total of less than 3 instances for any purpose. But if you really want to deploy like a Galera cluster, a 3-node Galera cluster, you probably can't use MaxScale unless you pay a license fee. And the license fee is actually not for MaxScale, it's actually for the 3 nodes behind it. So I'd say this is more or less software that, while has plenty of potential, is probably not something you really want to deploy today. ProxySQL is described as by DBAs for DBAs. It does pretty much everything. It can do read-write split, it can do failover, caching, rewriting, blocking like a firewall. It supports Galore Cluster host groups, it supports group replication out of the box. It's got monitoring. It's actually a pretty good piece of kit. The developers are actually responsive on GitHub. Does anybody use ProxySQL? Okay, so I hope more people maybe take a look at it as a proxy of choice for your servers. So when it comes to clouds as well, we noticed that Amazon RDS ships. Amazon has RDS for like 5.5, 5.6, 5.7, 8.0, as well as MariaDB server, and of course you've got Aurora MySQL. As I said earlier, Amazon says now failovers typically take less than 35 seconds when you use the multi-AZ option. So, and they also have 2 times faster transaction commit latencies. So your transactions are committing faster because DRBD had a 50 to 60% overhead, and you're getting super fast failover with semi-synchronous replication. So not choosing a modern RDS with multi-AZ is probably not good for you any longer. You should consider making sure you're on a modern version of RDS. So there's Google Cloud, which ships 8.0 as the default. There's Azure. Azure, honestly, I feel like is probably going to drop MariaDB server at some stage because they're offering such old versions of MariaDB that no one recommends you to use. So I think it's on its last legs. And Azure isn't afraid of killing stuff. Like they had a blockchain at one stage, they killed it. They had one very large custom on it, Singapore Airlines, one that I enjoy flying. Now they have to maintain this blockchain project just for only one customer, literally. So use a database. Alibaba Cloud actually supports the likes of 5.5 all the way to new upgrades. It supports MariaDB, but strangely it doesn't support open source MariaDB. It only supports enterprise MariaDB. And Oracle Cloud. Anybody here try Oracle Cloud? It's actually fairly impressive. They've got pretty good free credits. And HeatWave is actually useful. HeatWave probably gives Amazon and the open source variants of MySQL a huge run for their money. So we have plenty of these enterprise editions out there, like MySQL Enterprise, you got to pay for it. MariaDB Galera Cluster also comes with MariaDB Enterprise. CodaShip's also gone down the path of offering an enterprise piece of kit. several lines cluster control, well worth mentioning because it's still very reasonable piece of software, but also closed source. Planet scale, you'll have talk later for sure. It's got a nice cloud service front end to Vitess, and more really. So highly recommend you take a gander. Continuum, as I said, has been pivoting many times. Now they call it, I think, tungsten clustering. Also gone down the enterprise path. And I'd be remiss to mention that there's something called MariaDB Sky SQL as well. So there are many companies looking at ways of making sure that you can take open source and then somehow find some kind of commercial business model around it. And a lot of it seems to be around either additional features. Though additional features don't give you very long runway, because eventually there will be an open source variant. So a good example is Codeship, Galera Cluster, non-blocking operations, which Percona has ported. And other things could be ported. And of course, the other one is cloud, right? You can obviously do stuff around orchestration that would make things much simpler for people, that would ensure that you have maybe a much longer runway, a much higher barrier to entry for someone to port those features. Also, I didn't mention it, but does anybody know that MariaDB shell exists? So MySQL shell, very, very common, it's been around for years. MariaDB shell uses fish, and they decided to make it for enterprise only though, but it can also be used to actually maintain your Galore clusters, the MariaDB expand, etc., all via the shell tool. So that's something unique, like developing a shell from scratch and making it enterprise only. So where are things now? Slave prefetching or replication booster. We don't use that anymore. We use interschema parallel replication. Things like InnoDB fake changes, you don't need them anymore. Tungsten replicator, once leading, now really has lots of open source variants. MySQL utilities. At one stage, there's a MySQL failover tool. It's now you just have MySQL shell. MMM for multi-master replication hasn't been updated in more than a decade. Consider it dead. There are plenty of other solutions that you should probably take a look at. Percona monitoring and management, open source, good solution. You've got replication manager, provided by Signal 18, run by at least 3 people and a fairly famous consultant. Useful piece of kit. Also, you can load up things with OpenSVC. There's Galore Manager. So this one's interesting as well because it's not open source software, but it's a free binary. So you can use it, but maybe at some stage it may not be free any longer. Community consumption of binary logs is alive and well. There's Maxwell's Daemon still getting updates, even up to a few weeks ago. And even with high availability, you need backups. So extra backup, continually maintained. Congratulations to the Percona team for actually releasing extra backup like super fast. The latest release came out very shortly after the server release because extra backup is tied to InnoDB. Maria backup, fork of extra backup, but now considered also improvement. Also can run on Windows if you need it. MyDumper still very much utilized, and you can do backups even with MySQL shell. So, more or less, in conclusion, I'd say you should always be using replication. Consider the likes of Galera Cluster or InnoDB Cluster. Use a proxy like ProxySQL. Use something like Orchestrator with caution. And one more thing before we sort of end is pay particular attention to what information you find on the internet. How often do you still find on the internet to set VM swappiness equals 0? Where you know that this will actually eventually call the out-of-memory killer to kill your MySQLD. And I think one of the biggest things that you find after all these years is integration that is actually missing inside of the MySQL ecosystem, which probably is why there is a huge opportunity for consulting to exist. Like we know ProxySQL rocks. We also know that MySQL 8 has had a new password mechanism for probably as long as the server has existed. But you still need workarounds to make passwords to sync, for example. So this is kind of vaguely uncool. And then of course we can go and talk about roles, etc., how they all make changes. the good news is that MySQL has also got plenty of books. None of them particularly focus on high availability. One of the book authors is even here. MySQL Cookbook, right there. Alkin, you can go to his talk later. High performance MySQL does include some related stuff on high availability. There's learning MySQL, teaches you how to actually set up replication, bonus. Efficient MySQL performance also has very minimal stuff around HA. And there are a couple more books as well that can, help enable you. So, yeah, with that, I'd like to say thank you. I'm open to any questions if you have them, or yeah, you have a short break as per plan before your next talk. Questions? Yes.
I don't use my ISAM by choice. I need to use it because an open source system that I use for my industry, and actually in Mexico is that this system is like the industry standard for call centers.
For cloud centers?
Call center, yes.
Oh, call centers, okay.
Yes. So the only replication that I have used with this system is a master slave replication, but it always get out of sync. So it basically uses like at some point I need to dump and start over the replication. So I'm wondering, is there any option to use with my ISAM? I know it's ancient technology, but the system relies on table loading.
What version of MySQL is it?
It's MariaDB 10.
So you can maybe switch to row-based replication. That might actually help you. And which version of MariaDB 10?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, you can stick to MyISAM in MariaDB if you like, but maybe switch the replication method from statement or mixed mode to row. That might alleviate some of your pain.
It's 10.5.8.
And do you know what replication mechanism you're using?
I have tried to do the replication again like 3 years ago because something I just give up. But it's not safe. I managed 23 clusters using this, and it's not safe for my mental load. I don't know why.
It's the software that they get is using MyISAM. How do you change the software? Requirement, yeah.
No, the thing is they rely on table logging for some kind of process, and it is 15 years old software, and they still.
It's closed source software, right?
No, it's open source.
Oh, it's open source.
Yeah, and they currently.
Maybe it's time to upgrade the open source software.
Yeah, the thing is they will rather add more features instead of refactor this like core part of the software.
Maybe we can help them migrate to MariaDB.
That would be awesome.
Maybe send an email.
Okay.
Or like we can hook. I mean, this is how MySQL became famous back in the day. People like would actually improve MediaWiki or WordPress schema to make it run more efficiently with MySQL, and that's actually how we got people to move away at MySQL AB from MyISAM to InnoDB even. Yeah. But yeah, maybe send email. Like we could totally work something, try to upgrade the software. Like if it's open source, this is easy.
Some years the open source that I use, they are scaled. I don't know if they think they're going to come with.
Yeah, if it's open source, like it's easy. It's the closed source software. We always hear like, oh, we have this closed source piece of software. It's stuck on MyISAM, or it's doing silly things like, engine equals or type equals some, engine name, and then you can't use a modern MySQL with it. So then we say, okay, you can put a proxy in front of it, but in your case, it's open source, should be easy. Okay, well, thank you. We'll send an email.